Before I begin this retrospective, I want to give you all a notice that I will be making an announcement at the end of this video regarding an upcoming project. If you're a frequent viewer of my channel and enjoy my Alvin and the Chipmunks content, I definitely advise that you stick around. Anyways, on with the show. Hello Chipmunk and Chipette fans, my name is Grandy Tamias, and welcome to the last of my Alvin and the Chipmunks film retrospectives, unless I decide to cover Minimonks. And to celebrate its 15th anniversary, I will be covering the 2007 live-action movie released by 20th Century Fox. Oh boy, this movie. I'll be honest, I wasn't looking forward to doing this retrospective since, of the 4 live-action movies, this one is my least favorite. Not because it's bad, even though it has some glaring flaws, but because it just isn't as interesting when compared to the 3 that came after it. As all sequels should do, the Squeakquel, Chipwrecked, and Road Chip introduced new characters, upped the action and suspense, and expanded upon the themes of the series. In that sense, the first Alvin and the Chipmunks film is a good foundation, but on its own, it doesn't do enough to put its best foot forward, and so the sequels had to do a lot of heavy lifting. And unless you know me well enough from my other videos, you might be clueless as to what I mean by that. I guess now's a good time to say that if you actually prefer this film over any or all of the sequels, I respect that opinion. And I can understand if you're still skeptical since I haven't gotten into some of the individual aspects yet. But before I get to those, I do want to talk about my experience with this film when it first came out. To be honest, as much as 8-year-old me loved this movie, I don't remember going to the theater to watch it, but I'm almost certain that I did. I just can't remember which theater it was that I saw it at, and I keep having conflicting memories of whether it was my dad or granddad who took me and my brother to see it. Maybe the sequels gave me a mental block on this movie because I remember my theater experiences with those much more clearly. But all I am sure about is that once it came out on DVD, I watched the hell out of it. And as my dad would often do, he quoted a few lines from the film in a funny voice. Like whenever I was helping him fold laundry, he'd throw one of my pairs of pants to me and say Dave's line, "Pants are essential." And while I don't have the soundtrack anymore because the disc got scratched up, I used to listen to it in the car on road trips. Which I guess means I should briefly talk about the film's music. I had already known about the Chipmunk song, but I wasn't the kind of kid who would actively listen to popular music from my dad's generation, or even my own generation, unless it was attached to some big movie or show. So Alvin and the Chipmunks was my first exposure to songs like Bad Day and Only You. It was also my first exposure to Witch Doctor, and I remember as a kid hating it in the movie, and in fact I still kind of hate it. I would always skip it when it first came on. But then I heard the original 1958 version in the soundtrack and I'm like, oh, this is actually really good. Compared to the sequels, this film's soundtrack has a lot more original songs. In my opinion, most of the songs are hit or miss, but Follow Me Now and Coast to Coast were definitely standouts for me. Before I get into the plot, I want to talk about the characters and confess something. As I've said before, I was introduced to this franchise as far back as I can remember from listening to the original Chipmunk song on the radio whenever I would travel downstate to visit relatives for Christmas. And maybe seeing a few images of the Chipmunks here and there, but that was it. I didn't really get to know them or their personalities until the movies, and I didn't even know about Dave at all. He's never addressed by name in the original song, and I never questioned who that man was whose voice I heard, so I assumed that Dave was made up for the 2007 movie. But years later, when I watched Meet the Wolfman, I saw the Dave in that film and realized, oh, he's always been their father. As far as the Jason Lee version of Dave as a character is concerned, I'll once again be honest and say that while I do like him, I wasn't really compelled to root for him. I was always more interested in what the Chipmunks were doing. Like, did we really need that scene where he's at an energy bar meeting and he gets fired because the Chipmunks drew on his presentation boards? The scene doesn't add anything to the story, and the humor was unnecessarily crude. I know some people didn't like Dave's whole subplot with Claire either, but at least that did have a payoff by getting him into the theater to rescue the Chipmunks. And his personality, it was hard to take him seriously even before the Chipmunks entered his life. At the beginning, Ian Hawke tells him that he should just give up on his music career because, as a record executive, he, quote-unquote, knows that no one would ever want to sing the songs that he writes. And Dave, having been friends with Ian since college, takes it so personally that when he gets home, he throws out all of his music equipment. I never thought that what he did was a normal thing people would do. If I were in Dave's position and a friend advised me to give up on something, I might think about it, but I wouldn't take their word as final. If a friend is giving you advice that you disagree with, even if that advice is coming from the heart, you don't have to give into it just because they're your friend, just as long as no one's getting hurt. With me personally, there have been times where my friends gave me advice that I didn't agree with, but turning it down didn't end my relationships with them. Good friends always know that even if they disagree on something, there are still a lot of good things they can bring to the world together. But of course, Ian's advice wasn't coming from the heart and was really just his rather harsh way of letting Dave down easy. Speaking of Ian, he's much more difficult to take seriously because of his over-the-top attitude and overall lack of depth beyond just wanting to make a quick buck. As I mentioned earlier, he did go to college with Dave, but that link in their relationship doesn't play a factor into his decisions over the course of the film. Like, when he gets the opportunity to have the Chipmunks live with him and make them superstars, he doesn't tell Dave, "I'm sorry them living with you didn't work out." No, instead he rubs it in Dave's face and says, "Told you, Dave, I never lose." Even if this is just who Ian is, a greedy guy who would throw his own friends under the bus to make a profit, the lack of any weight behind those decisions doesn't make him a compelling villain. To be fair, Harry from the 80s cartoon, who Ian is at least partly inspired by, wasn't any better. And even though his character development was disjointed over the next two films, as I talked about last year, at least Ian got character development, unlike Harry, who stayed the same in all 4 episodes he appeared in. I've gone into more detail about the similarities between Harry and Ian in one of my first few videos, so I won't dwell on it too much here. But be warned, the audio quality is dreadful, and I really need to get around to remastering it sometime. While I, like most or all of you watching, knew Ian Hawke first, part of me now does kind of wish that they used Harry in the films instead. But I guess it would have been weird to have Dave's friend-slash-boss be a chipmunk. And now let's get to the stars themselves, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore. This film was my first true exposure to their personalities, and after I got more into their previous shows and movies years later, I'd say that they were faithfully represented for the most part. There were a few times where it seemed like they were acting more mature and saying things that kids their age would never normally say, and Dave even calls them out on this halfway through the film. Though I guess the definition of kids can be stretched given the whole chipmunks aging differently than humans thing I've talked about before, and there are 8 years between this film and Road Chip, where they still aren't considered adults. If anything, they were teenagers in that film, which would put them at less than 10 in 2007. Actually, wait, this movie's events span over a Christmas and several months after, so does the movie begin in 2006 and go into 2007, or does it begin in 2007 and go into 2008? Going slightly into the future of when this movie was released in real life. Personally, I assume the latter, but it still doesn't answer exactly how old the Chipmunks are, or the year that they were born. I'm getting sidetracked again. Simon has always been my favorite chipmunk for the simple fact that he loves science. Oh, and he wears glasses, like me. With most movies and shows, I tend to gravitate towards the intellectual characters, and while this movie, or any of the movies for that matter, didn't go as far as showing him building inventions like in the cartoons, I still think that he would be able to outsmart any human in the world of these films. I did find him much more relatable in the later films, especially Chipwrecked, which is another reason I really liked that film. In this one, he really shows off more of his sarcastic side, such as when he reminds Dave to pay the utility bill. And he can be as wild as Alvin sometimes, like when they're playing with all the toys in Ian's mansion, and earlier when he says, "Claire is Dave's mate, ooh la la." Like, 80s Simon would never say that, but I guess 2007 Simon didn't yet have that inhibition mentioned in Chipwrecked. Theodore, I honestly don't have as much to say about. Again, he is improved upon in the sequels, like with his emotional side in Road Chip, but in retrospect, I think this film and the movie era as a whole perpetuated the common belief that Theodore is this idiot who loves eating and has the emotional rigidity of a baby. Honestly, this topic still deserves its own video. For now, if I were to say something positive about him in the context of this film, the best scene with him was when he was on the roof of Ian's mansion with his brothers and helped him realize that they feel more at home with Dave. Last but not least, Alvin's personality as the fun-loving, charismatic troublemaker is amped up to 11 from prior incarnations. He is constantly making quips and references, and he probably causes the greatest amount of destruction. He gets a notable amount of development by the end with how he learns to view Dave like a dad, and Alvin's interactions with Ian definitely now feel like that they were foreshadowing how he'd view Brittany and the Squeakquel. And I know this has probably been said to death in the community, but the end of this movie is the only time Alvin is shown wearing his classic baseball cap, and I kind of wish that he had worn it more often. I mean, his design works very well without it, but I feel like his silhouette could have been made much more distinct if he had kept it. I have a few random thoughts and observations that I want to mention as well. When Alvin inhales gas from a balloon, his voice gets deeper. I know a lot of people were confused and like, what? Does helium have a reverse effect on chipmunks that it does on humans? No, if it were helium, their voices would get even higher. What's actually happening is that Alvin's balloon contains a gas that is denser than air, such as sulfur hexafluoride. If you're a fan of Mythbusters, Adam Savage explained it, so I won't go into detail here. As I was watching the scene where Simon gets shot out of a tennis ball cannon and into the pool, I realized something. Simon gets submerged in water at least once in every film. In the Squeakquel, the bullies dunk him in a toilet. In Chipwrecked, he willingly dives into the basin of a waterfall as Simone. And in Road Chip, he accidentally skateboards into another pool. Huh, weird. One of the highlights of this film series is the designs of the chipmunks themselves. In a lot of other cartoon communities, you'll always hear people rag on how they ruin character designs when they bring them to live action, and there are certainly fans like that in the Alvin and the Chipmunks community. And don't get me wrong, I love the original character designs. But, be honest, you would never know that these are chipmunks without the title telling you so. Giving them stripes and clearly visible tails definitely makes them seem more natural, especially given this film's emphasis on how they came from the forest. I already made a video about these designs, so if you're interested in hearing more about my perspective on why they work so well and my interest in them as a species, definitely check it out. When we're first introduced to them, they're collecting nuts for winter and stuffing them into a pine tree. Despite what this scene may have you believe, chipmunks don't actually live in trees. They're ground squirrels, and build burrows on the forest floor. Then again, they never say that they live in this tree. They could have just been using it to store nuts. Also, where is Theodore getting the nuts from? It's just the three of them in the tree, and yet Theodore is grabbing them as if they're being passed to him. Anyway, this scene is actually one of my favorites in the movie for the simple fact that we get to see anthro chipmunks living in the wild. This, coupled with the 80s interpretation of Vinny living in the forest and the lack of other chipmunks in society, kind of perpetuated the general assumption in the fandom that if there are other chipmunks besides the Seville brothers and the Chipettes, they're just in the wild, waiting to be rediscovered. And while we do get some details about their parents early on in the movie, we don't know a lot about their lives in the forest prior to the movie, and I'd have loved to see that expanded upon. Like, Alvin mentions competing with gophers, earthworms, and a sparrow for nuts, and I think there would have been a good story to tell there. Oh, and I didn't know where else to mention this, but the cut that Alvin has on his ear, I've actually seen some debate over the several years that I've been in the fandom discussing how he got it. Personally, I think it was from an encounter with one of those animals he mentioned, probably either the gopher or the sparrow. And I like how they kept this detail consistent, even when their designs got updated for Road Chip. And one last thing I want to mention about this scene is that I wish in a future reboot we could get an origin story that takes inspiration from this movie or borrow some elements, like the chipmunks being taken from the forest either intentionally or unintentionally by humans. Again, realistically, chipmunks don't live in the canopy of trees, but I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it if they wanted to use that as the way that they get to human civilization. Okay, so now the main plot. This movie actually takes inspiration from multiple episodes and real-life events from throughout the history of the Alvin and the Chipmunks franchise. For instance, we get the origin of the Chipmunk song. A financially struggling David Seville is determined to come up with a new hit song for a record business, and later the Chipmunks become an overnight sensation, similar to what happened in real life with Ross Bagdasarian Sr. We also get the greedy business guy who takes the Chipmunks away from Dave for an extended period of time to go on tour and acts as their uncle figure, pulled from the 80s series Season 1 episode Uncle Harry. As I discussed way back in my retrospective of the Squeakquel, that film and this one have the issue of having too many plot lines. And in the case of the 2007 film, it's probably worse. This movie juggles so many concepts that work fine as individual episodes, but when putting them to film, more does not equal better. Sure, you can reference moments from the cartoons when they don't have enough substance to fill an entire movie, and subplots can't exist, but when you're constantly switching between goals that have nothing to do with each other, the end of the movie doesn't feel like a result of whatever we started with. This film covers how the Chipmunks met Dave, them celebrating Christmas, how they became rock stars, and pretty much everything to do with them living with Uncle Ian. That last one, for example, I mentioned earlier how there was no weight behind Ian's decision to let the chipmunks live with him, but it kind of works both ways. Yes, there certainly is some of that, hence how we have the conflict at the end, but I feel like there would have been even more weight if we had gotten to know the chipmunks' relationship with Dave over the course of an entire film, and they decided briefly to live with Ian in the second one or a later film. To trim down the number of plot lines, or at least streamline them, here's how I would have written this movie. Alvin, Simon, and Theodore are living in the forest where all they do is collect nuts for survival, and they aspire to be something more. One day, their tree gets cut down, and they're brought to human civilization. There they meet a songwriter named David Seville, who works for Jet Records. Both Dave and the company are struggling financially because Ian Hawke, one of the executives, is greedy and bought a mansion on the company's dime. With Christmas fast approaching, they need to come up with a new hit song or else Dave will be out of a job. The Chipmunks' discovery of Christmas leads them to help Dave create the Chipmunk song. The only problem is, Ian doesn't think it would become such a big hit, so they set out to prove him wrong by gaining public interest. Luckily, Dave's ex-girlfriend, Claire Wilson, is a photojournalist who has connections that could get them a gig. But to convince Claire, the Chipmunks need to repair Dave's relationship with her. Maybe their attempt works or doesn't work, but eventually they get a performance locally. Ian becomes convinced to take a chance with the Chipmunks and get them an even bigger performance, and they become popular enough that they save Jet Records from bankruptcy. The movie ends with the Chipmunks, Dave, and Claire all celebrating Christmas together, and Alvin does something that makes Dave yell his name before the credits roll. Maybe even a post-credit scene where they tease the Chipettes for the sequel. Bam! Much better movie. So yeah, I don't think that the Chipmunks living with Ian plotline was particularly necessary. Even though what we got out of it did help Dave develop as a character, there could have been other ways to explore his bond with the Chipmunks. Oh yeah, and they should have toned down the humor. Not only does a lot of it go by at a mile a minute, but like I said, it was also really crude. Like with the toilet humor, this film and Road Chip are the biggest offenders. Even as a kid, I could not stand the raisin scene. I dare you to name a single person who asked for this. For what it is, though, Alvin and the Chipmunks 2007 is an alright film. It had some impressive moments and brought some new concepts to the table, but the lack of a centralized plot makes it feel like a completely different movie from time to time. As an origin story, it kind of drops the ball on that too, since certain things are established so fast that they don't feel integrated into the story. The Chipmunks themselves can act either too mature or too immature, depending on the situation, but their designs are really cool and make me want to learn more about them. This film may not have the greatest soundtrack either, but at least it does justice to the original Chipmunk song. As weak as I consider this film to be now, I still have a lot to thank it for, and I'm curious to know how it has impacted you over its 15-year legacy. Before I go, I have some news that I want to share about a project I mentioned in my update videos, and I didn't want to have to wait until I do another one in a few months before I bring it up again. Some of you may know that I had plans to do an Alvin and the Chipmunks iceberg video. I even consulted with several other members of the community to gather all sorts of facts. However, we were having some trouble categorizing these facts into the different layers of the iceberg because a lot of them are really obscure, and I didn't want to just fill the upper layers with super common knowledge stuff by comparison. So I was thinking of reworking the project into a series of fact videos, maybe 10 or 15 at a time, with no particular levels of obscurity. I currently don't have a name for this series yet either, so feel free to suggest one in the comments. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed this retrospective, have a happy holidays, and thank you for your time.